I got a question here from a pre-law advisor. She writes, I'm trying to provide accurate advice to my students about the upcoming law school admission cycle. With recent changes to the LSAT format and the changing admissions landscape, what are some predictions or trends we can expect coming up in the next admission cycle? How should students prepare to adapt to these changes, and what can they do to enhance their odds of admission in this changing environment? Great question here. There have been a lot of changes. Of course, you're already aware of the upcoming removal of the logic game section after the June LSAT. Starting in August, we're going to have 2 scored logical reasoning sections and 1 scored reading comp, rather than 1 scored section of each of games, reasoning, and reading comp. So for the students you're dealing with right now, I would help them decide whether to take the LSAT with the game section in April or June, or without the game section starting in August. Of course, aiming for April now, it's a bit tight. If someone is brand new to the LSAT, I'd recommend not aiming for April, in which case I'd also recommend not aiming for June, because if a student studies for the June LSAT with the games, any work they devote to games will be irrelevant if they retake it in August. So for your students, for your advisees, I would probably recommend at this point, if they're new to the LSAT, just aim for August without logic games. And then of course they could focus more time on logical reasoning, which of course will deserve that attention. Let them know that law schools will not care whether they took the LSAT with the game section or without the game section. It's all the same to the law schools. They just want, of course, the highest score possible. Just like law schools didn't care whether students took the LSAT with the LSAT Flex format at the beginning of the pandemic or the 4-section format that we're currently experiencing right now. We may see a slight reduction in LSAT medians because it'll be harder to get a super high LSAT score without the games section. Games is the most learnable and perfectible section. Of course, LSAT will likely adjust the so-called curve or raw score conversions to account for this, but in the short term, there may be some changes at the very, very high end, and I'm talking here 175 plus. Another factor that a lot of folks have not yet been talking about is the fact that the upcoming presidential election may impact the number of people applying to law school as well. Back in 2016, there was a so-called Trump bump, leading students to apply to law school in reaction to the election of Donald Trump. A lot of pre-law students concerned about social justice went to law school as a reaction to Donald Trump's election, wanting to, of course, counteract what he's doing in his administration. We saw a bump of roughly 8% that admission cycle in 2020. Of course, the pandemic was also a factor, but in that admission cycle associated with that election, we saw a 13% bump in the number of students applying to law school. So similarly, in this 2024 admission cycle, as Donald Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee going head-to-head against Joe Biden, we may see a similar bump in the number of students applying to law school. Similarly, with a shaky economic situation, that's another factor that may lead more students to go to law school to wait out a rough economic situation. Yet another factor we see at play in this admissions cycle is the impact of the SCOTUS ban on affirmative action. Since the Supreme Court banned affirmative action back in June of 2023, law schools reacted by changing their applications. They removed diversity statements from their applications to avoid the perception that they were attempting to violate the ban on affirmative action, and replaced those diversity statement prompts with new optional essay prompts that are typically unique to their school, meaning it is more difficult to reuse the same application essays for multiple schools. In reaction to this, a lot of students are applying to fewer schools because it's harder to do all those different application essays. This is really a shame because the more schools you apply to, the more offers you're going to get, and the more scholarship money you'll be offered, meaning you'll be in a better position to negotiate and play different schools off each other. If you don't apply to as many schools, you have less negotiating leverage. And so as an advisor, I would encourage you to tell your students to start the application essays earlier so they can still apply to the same number of schools. I typically recommend applying to at least 10, 12 schools to maximize the offers that you're going to get. So again, to recap, we have the removal of logic games after the June LSAT. Someone starting now should probably aim to take the LSAT starting in August. We have a potential Trump bump, increasing the number of students applying to law school this fall in reaction to the presidential election happening this year. And finally, we have students who are applying to fewer law schools because it's hard to do the applications due to the Supreme Court ban on affirmative action, changing the questions asked, removing the diversity statements, adding new optional essay prompts. If any of your students would like my help in preparing for law school, taking the LSAT, I'd be glad to help. There are a variety of ways I can support them in navigating this difficult, confusing landscape. We have live online classes via Zoom, on-demand video courses, small group coaching, and one-on-one coaching, and we are adjusting our courses to react to the removal of logic games and the addition of that second scored logical reasoning section. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.